On May 29, 1911, Chekhov's The Cherry Orchard was performed for the first time on the British stage. The production was staged by the Independent Stage Society at London's Aldwych Theatre. The premiere drew a full house and caused real excitement, but the critics weren't having it. The Daily Chronicle complained about the general eclecticism of the staging. Reviewers grumbled about the play structure, about how scenes of high drama suddenly gave way to farce. Times critic even concluded, "It seems highly unlikely that Russians are, in fact, as foolish as they are portrayed in this play." And yet, not everyone saw it as a mess. According to his biographer, when the curtain fell, George Bernard Shaw turned to the director Frederick Welland and said, "I feel I must tear up all my plays and start everything over." Hello and welcome. My name is Armen Zakarian, and today we're talking about the Chekhov phenomenon. We'll try to figure out how Chekhov completely changed the world of fiction. We'll try to understand what exactly this writer did to literature that made George Bernard Shaw want to tear up all his plays. Why did Hemingway, Salinger, and Catherine Mansfield line up metaphorically for Chekhov's writing masterclass? And how come British writer John Middleton Murray, a contemporary of Proust, Lawrence, and Joyce, once said, "Chekhov is far ahead of everything that is called modern in literature. It is his work that literature must now measure itself against." It has been said once that the perfect short story is the kind of tale you could retell to a fellow passenger in the smoking room of an ocean liner. And for a long time, that's exactly what short fiction was, until Chekhov came along. In his light summer coat and straw hat, he walked into literature with a bold new vision. His stories amazed reader not so much by what he added to literature, but by what he took out. One phrase from his letters became almost a manifesto. When you finish a short story, cross out the beginning and the end. That's where we, fiction writers, lie the most. And he lived by that rule. Take the opening of his famous short story, The Lady with the Dog. It was said that a new face had been seen on the promenade, a lady with a little dog. You see, no backstory, no introduction, no exposition. Just a scene already in motion. Chekhov enters a story without even knocking the door. The use of passive voice creates distance and frames the story through rumor, not sure truth. We aren't introduced to the character directly. Instead, we hear about her through gossip and vague observations. The character herself isn't given a name, a backstory, or even a personality, only a label shaped by what others notice. The image of a lady with a little dog is at once specific and almost laughably trivial, and yet it becomes the anchor for everything that follows. With that one quiet detail, Chekhov captures how people are seen, misguided, and flattened into types. But this seemingly minor character will turn out to be the heart of a deeply emotional story. The line is simple, but it shows Chekhov's genius. He doesn't begin with plot or drama, but with atmosphere and perception. Same thing happens, for example, in the story Name Day. Listen to its opening. After the name day lunch, with its 8 courses and endless conversation, the name day man's wife, Olga Mikhailovna, went out into the garden. Look at how much ground Chekhov covers in just one sentence. The story has only just begun, but somehow the lunch is already over, 8 courses, endless chatter, and a birthday man we don't even get to meet by name. It's all behind us, left off the page. Chekhov doesn't describe it, he skips it. But you still feel it happened. However, for Chekhov, just slipping into a story without knocking isn't enough. He insists on leaving the room with the door wide open, letting the wind in, and scattering loose threads all over the floor, ignoring everything we were told stories are supposed to do. Quite the same thing he does with the nature of openings, he also does with the nature of endings. Take the short story The Pianist. It's barely a sketch, a slice from the life of Pyotr Rublov, a former student of conservatory who traveled to Moscow dreaming of becoming a composer, maybe a concert pianist, and ended up playing background music at cheap weddings. He tells us casually about what just happened at one of those weddings. It's classic Chekhov material. Pyotr starts chatting with a young woman, and this chat leads to a deep conversation. She's passionate, interested in music. They argue, they connect. Until, of course, someone leans in and whispers in her ear, "You do know you're talking to the pianist, right? He's beneath you. You're a lady. You are not supposed to act like that." And she immediately leaves. Now, Pyotr's used to this. He's been treated like furniture before, but this time it hits differently. Something inside him breaks. He remembers everything he hoped for, everything he gave up, and he has a breakdown. They kick him out, he goes back to his flat and shares this story with his neighbor. And that's it. That's the story. He finishes describing what happened during the wedding and bursts out laughing. At that point, the unmistakable Chekhov ending, the non-ending, comes. No closure, no resolution, just this sentence. Pyotr is laughing. And in his laughter, I can clearly hear hysteria. I start fussing over him and cursing that in Moscow hotel rooms, they never remember to leave out a glass of water for the night. And that's it. Right where another writer would insert a turning point, where a Lermontov hero would go off to die in the Caucasus, where Dostoevsky would stage a suicide and Tolstoy would send the man to the countryside to work the land and repent his foolish dream of making something of himself, Chekhov gives us a glass of water. And what happens next with the hero's life, with the girl, with the story, well, that's now your concern, my dear reader, and I'm not going to do this job for you. This is a textbook case of what scholars often call the impersonal open ending, one of Chekhov's signature moves, noted and admired by generations of literary critics. Before Chekhov, the gold standard for the short story was set by Edgar Allan Poe. Poe believed that a writer must keep the ending constantly in mind, that every sentence should serve it, and that a story should conclude with a sharp, satisfying full stop. Chekhov flips that logic on its head. Instead of ending with a period, he ends with an ellipsis. His stories don't resolve, they move. The final lines often feel less like an ending and more like a gentle push forward, a quiet continuation beyond the text. Take this line from his story, The Fiancé. She went upstairs to pack. And the next morning she said goodbye to her family and, cheerful and full of life, left the town, as she believed, forever. Or this one, from In the Raven. Lipa and Praskovia walked on, crossing themselves for a long time afterward. Or this, from A Commotion. Half an hour later, she was already on the road. You can't help but ask, what is going on with these people? Why won't they behave like normal literary characters and freeze on the final page with an expression of joy, grief, or existential despair? Why, at the very moment they're supposed to stop, they just keep walking? Well, because that is what Chekhov is all about. His stories aren't machines built to deliver catharsis. They're windows, cracked open just wide enough for life to drift in. Messy, unresolved, and half-spoken. Chekhov doesn't believe in narrative justice, in wrapping things up with poetic symmetry. No. He believes in momentum, in the quiet uncertainty of our lives. Moem, who both admired Chekhov and often disagreed with him, once remarked, "Chekhov's most insistent demand of short story writers is to cut off the beginnings and the endings. He did the same himself, and those close to him used to say that someone ought to take the manuscript away from him before he cut too much. Otherwise, all that would be left is the characters were young, they fell in love, got married, and were unhappy." When this was relayed to Chekhov, he replied, "But that's exactly how it works in real life." The next feature of Chekhov's prose I want to discuss with you is one of the most striking. I mean his refusal to rely on external action. In his short story, Nothing Might Happen, or even more Chekhovian, something almost happens, something that feels like it should happen and then it doesn't. And sometimes the only movement is internal, a flicker in the soul, brief and invisible. Take, for example, the story Boys, a piece that feels like it could have come from early Joyce. Two boys plan to run away to America. They imagine walking thousands of miles, fighting tigers and wild tribes, hunting, drinking, etc. But the main plot twist is they don't run away at all. And that's it. The story ends without adventure, without escape. But there's so much internal action you can almost feel the warmth of their fantasy cooling. The jungle fades, the haunting dreams dissolve, and in their place remains a still, empty room, and two boys who were, for a moment, brave enough to imagine something more. Try retelling that one in the smoking room of an ocean liner. Or take Dreams, for instance. Two policemen are escorting a vagrant to a nearby provincial town. They walk and they talk, and that's the whole story. Just one short conversation. But the genius of Chekhov is that by the time they fall silent again and continue down the muddy road, something has shifted. The wanderer shares his dream of reaching Siberia. Not the Siberia of exile and frost, but an imagined land of freedom and wide rivers where people are richer, the fish are endless, and the trees are so tall that your head spins when you look up. And that dream, absurd, out of place in the great slush of the present, awakens something in his companions. It brings up their own quiet thoughts about lives they didn't live, futures that never came. And whether out of envy that someone so poor, so hopeless, still dares to dream so big, or just frustration with the cold and mud, they snap. You make it to Siberia? You'll drop dead in a few days. He looks at their hard, unfeeling faces in horror. Without removing his cap, eyes wide, he quickly makes the sign of the cross. He's trembling all over, shaking his head, and his whole body begins to twist, like a caterpillar someone has stepped on. For the most gentle emotions, Chekhov always found images that were grounded, physical, and real. That caterpillar twisting underfoot is exactly that kind of image. But the crushed caterpillar keeps crawling. Toward freedom, toward death, we don't know. Chekhov's ending doesn't resolve, it simply moves on. A minute later, the travelers are already walking down the muddy road. The vagrant has bent even lower, his hands pushed deeper into his sleeves. The policeman says nothing. A simple setup. A man speaks of his dream, and no one believes him. But who before Chekhov could have turned that into a story so touching, so deep? He made a habit of doing just that. He was a true master of emotional detail, and his entire art is built on half tones and quiet breath. However, If Chekhov removes dramatic events, sweeping developments, and expansive exposition from his stories, then something must remain in their place. Some kind of internal structure must be left behind, a frame strong enough to carry the full weight of the reader's attention. That bridge, if you will, the thing that carries us from one bank of Chekhov's story to the other, is not plot, but texture. The texture that is made up of shifting intonations, a shimmer of gentle irony, a deep artistic economy of character, and the stillness of human life. But what holds that magnificent bridge up, the columns and supports beneath all that shimmering fabric, are of course the details. To speak of Chekhov as the master of the telling detail is almost a cliché. His friend, describing Chekhov during his stay in Italy, once wrote, "Chekhov paid attention to the smallest thing, unexpected things, things that seemed to me at the time completely uninteresting. The tour guide with the peculiar bald head, the voice of the woman selling violets in the Piazza San Marco, the endless ringing of the bells at Italian train stations." This natural precision, the instinct to notice every single detail, gives Chekhov's prose its quiet beauty. Let me give you two examples of how Chekhov uses detail in his character's speech. Take Mikhail, the postmaster and frequent companion of a doctor in Ward number 6. One of the features of his speech is always agreeing. Time after time he nods along with the doctor and says, "Absolutely right, correct, I can't agree more." And that kind of dialogue between them happens 3 or 4 times. But when his friend, the doctor, begins to lose his mind, when things are starting to shift and the others around him begin to worry, Chekhov writes, Mikhail, listening to him, no longer said, "Absolutely right," but instead said quietly, with confused hesitation, "Yes, yes, yes." You see, the difference between "absolutely right" and "yes, yes, yes" may seem tiny, but in that tiny shift lies a whole palette of emotion. As Chekhov himself tells us, confusion, but also doubt, sadness, fear for a friend, a quiet cloud of worry and helplessness. That's the real distance between absolutely right and yes, yes, yes. And that's where Chekhov lives, in the flicker between the words. And another example from one of my favorite stories since childhood, The Fat and the Thin. At the train station, 2 old school friends meet after many years apart. One is fat, the other thin. Both are pleasantly stunned by the meeting, and so, naturally, they begin to tell each other about their lives. The thin is a clerk, not exactly a star. He carves wooden cigarette cases and sells them to help his family budget. Introducing the family, he says, "This is my wife, Louisa, a Lutheran, and this is my son, a third-year schoolboy." And just a couple of lines later, he repeats it again. "And this is my wife, a Lutheran." But then comes the turning point. When the fat casually mentions that he has risen to the rank of state consul, the thin instantly changes his tone. Your Excellency, what an honor, sir, my childhood friend, and suddenly you've turned into such an important man, sir, sir." The fat, of course, begs him to drop the rank worship between childhood friends, but the thin simply can't help himself anymore, and here Chekhov inserts one of those perfect, devastating details. "This is, Your Excellency, my son, Nathaniel, my wife, Louisa, a Lutheran, in a certain manner." Do you feel that? For most writers, it would be enough to say that the thin turned pale, that his face twisted into a nervous smile that would already do the job, but for Chekhov, that's not enough. He has to drive the nail of one last brilliant detail into his bridge. And so, in the thin final line, my wife, Louisa, a Lutheran, mutates into my wife, Louisa, a Lutheran, in a certain manner. You see, the thin, trembling before the authority of his high friend, loses control of his speech. He can't simply say, wife Louisa, a Lutheran anymore, because in the presence of a state consul, such smallness feels absurd and even embarrassing. And so, like his son, Nathaniel, bowing his little foot in apology, the thin bows instead with his tongue. My wife Louisa, a Lutheran, in a certain manner. And this, I think, is the secret. Chekhov showed that literature doesn't need thunder to be powerful. He replaced plot with texture, replaced resolution with hesitation, replaced loud crashes with a tiny detail. He trusted readers enough to leave them with half-finished moves, with conversations that trail off, with characters who keep walking down the muddy road after the story has already ended. Before Chekhov, the short story was often a well-oiled machine, everything moving toward a final bang, a twist, a moral. But in Chekhov, you won't find that. He refuses to be the judge of his characters. After Chekhov, the short story became something else entirely, not a mechanism, but a mirror in which life itself appears. Messy, unresolved, undramatic, but alive. His stories showed that the smallest shift could capture the entire tragedy of a man's existence. Joyce, Salinger, Hemingway, Sherwood Anderson, each of them would later write short stories in a way that feels unmistakably Chekhovian. But here's the thing, he does that in the middle of 1880s. At that moment, Salinger's parents hadn't even met. Joyce was 3 years old, Hemingway hadn't been born, Sherwood Anderson was 10. That's why it was said so often about him that he was ahead of his time. But there's more. Chekhov changed not just how stories were written, but how we read them. He taught us to look at silences, to listen between the words, to pay attention to the minor key. He made literature less about what happens and more about how it feels when it does or when it doesn't. And in doing so, he opened the door to modern fiction, to all the writers who learned that the true drama is often invisible, and the real ending is often off the page. Thank you for being with us today. We appreciate your support and involvement. So feel free to share your thoughts in the comments below, give us a like, and stay with us if you want to hear more stories like this one. And for now, call me Armin, and I'll see you next time.